News Channel 5 network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here with you on a Wednesday, and we've got a good show on tap. An interesting show with, I think, some things you're going to want to listen to this morning. Some of them a little bit scary. Some of them, I think, obviously educational. And, of course, as always, we'll open up the phone lines for you to ask questions about possibly a malpractice case that could have occurred to a friend of you or a loved one or even yourself, as we're going to talk this morning with malpractice attorney Clint Kelly. It's good to have you on, sir.
Good morning, Nick.
It's always a pleasure.
See you. Yeah.
Nice to see you every month. And what I was telling you at home is that he sits down with me, and Clint follows these things, obviously, because this is your career. But he pays attention to a lot of some of these unusual, high-profile malpractice cases. And he sat down and he goes, Nick, I got a bunch for us this morning. And we'll get to those stories. Just want to remind all of you, if you want to join in the conversation, you can call. Remind folks, Clint, you're a malpractice attorney, and why should someone call?
Well, because I'm board certified in medical malpractice law. It's what I do for a living. I'm specially trained to handle these cases. They're very complex, very expensive. I take cases from the Nashville area and also take cases across the state because there are very few of us who are board certified. And medical malpractice is a major medical mistake that causes a major injury or death. And today we're going to talk about a lot of these that have occurred in the press. It's been pretty active the last month.
Yeah, this might help you get a handle on whether or not you'd like to call in. And the key on this, too, if you suspect something, we always talk about this every time he comes on, there's a statute of limitations.
Yes, always remember that you have 1 year from the date that you discover your injury to file what's called pre-suit notice, which is basically kicks off the lawsuit. If you wait 1 day after that year to file your pre-suit notice, you'll never get your day in court. So I always tell people, the call is free, the consultation is confidential. There's nothing wrong with picking up the phone and simply calling me or another certified malpractice lawyer and asking, hey, was I or a family member the victim of medical neglect or medical mistake? Because if you have a case, you'll then get your day in court.
There you go. So don't hesitate. Give a call, and you can join us here. And we'll take calls in a minute. But Clint and I, periodically will correspond when we see stories in the news. And he sent me something, and he's like, well, if it can happen to this guy, it can happen to anyone. And then I'm looking at the story, and let's talk about the case of Neil Armstrong, who I thought, of course, the man who landed on the moon, and he was in all the news recently with the anniversary. I thought he died after, some complications from a heart surgery that he didn't survive, and it was sad. And he was, I think, in his 80s. But it turns out then you see the story where his family settles for $6 million with the hospital.
Yeah, I was doing the same thing you were doing, Nick, last month. I was absorbing all of this, revisiting Apollo 11 and the lunar landing, and I'm fascinated by all that stuff. And I just happened to come across an article as I was going through the news about Neil Armstrong, of course, the first man that walked on the moon, that he had been a victim of malpractice himself. And I investigated it to try to determine exactly what happened. He went into an Ohio hospital to have a heart procedure, and it required the surgeons to go in there and attach wires from a pacemaker to his heart. It's a fairly routine procedure, a very high degree of success associated with these procedures. So he has this procedure and everything went fine. A nurse came and visited him after the surgery and removed the wires that were connected from the pacemaker to the heart. They were like temporary wires.
Okay, they're supposed to be removed.
Correct. Yeah. And one of the complications from that is a patient can bleed, and that's known, it's foreseeable. So what you're supposed to do when bleeding occurs and it's detected is you take the patient back to the OR, you open them back up, you suction out the blood, sew them back up, they're back in business, no problem. I mean, it happens quite frequently. For some reason, which we'll never understand, these folks at this hospital, instead of taking him to the OR, took him to a cath lab. It's a more intimate setting. And they didn't get a cardiac surgeon involved. They got a cardiologist who basically stuck a syringe in there and tried to draw the blood out from around his heart. And that procedure is not as successful as opening the patient up. And you can never be sure you got all the blood out. Well,
or stop the bleeding.
In his case, they didn't do either. They didn't stop the bleeding. They didn't get all the blood out. He succumbed to the bleeding and died in the hospital.
Unbelievable.
And I told you, Nick, we revisited some time ago the Joan Rivers case. And I think what happens, this is just my theory, I've got no support for this other than what I think. When celebrities go to hospitals, I think doctors and staff can sometimes treat them differently. Instead of following the routine that they might otherwise for a typical patient, they want to handle it themselves their way in, as I said, a more intimate setting, like with Joan Rivers. Instead of her being in the hospital to handle her heart procedure that she needed after she had a heart failure, she was in an outpatient clinic where they didn't have as many people who were certified in advanced life support care. And I think with Neil Armstrong, the same thing happened here. Someone wanted to handle it intimately and take care of it on their own instead of bringing the entire staff in and handle it like you would for a routine patient. So Neil Armstrong, unfortunately, may have been a victim of his own celebrity.
Wow. Okay. And you think about it, if they had done things right, he could be alive today. Imagine.
They should have done things right. Yeah.
All right. So the key on this, when it went to litigation and a lawsuit was filed by his two sons.
There was never a lawsuit.
Oh, there was never a lawsuit.
There was never a lawsuit. Let me tell you what happened.
Okay. How did it resolve?
When this was discovered, there was an investigation done by the hospital team and by the Armstrong family. They had their own experts and attorneys looking at this thing. Both sides agreed the cause of death was taking him to the cath lab as opposed to going back into the OR and opening him up. So apparently they were negotiating a price and did not come to terms. And right before his funeral, an attorney for the family leaked out that there might be some notice of this negotiation in public because people would inquire, why did he die? So the hospital immediately contacted the lawyer. They got back together, and a $6 million settlement was arrived at.
Okay, and ultimately, since attorneys on both sides questioned experts on both sides, never went to trial, this is where standard of care comes in. So
Correct.
Experts on both sides, the doctors looked at it and said they did not follow the proper standard of care. Because, I mean, you can make the argument, okay, well, if the standard of care was, yeah, you could go to a cath lab and suck it out, and it just didn't work out. Well, sometimes mistakes or things don't go right, even when you're doing things correctly.
Right.
But they're saying, in both cases, from both sides, they did it wrong.
According to Fox News, the way they're reporting the story was there was unanimity in medical opinion that he should have been taken back to the OR and opened back up and the blood removed and then sewn back up and would have survived.
What's interesting to me too here is oftentimes, as you well know, and I know you've handled some of these cases, they're resolved outside of court.
Correct.
And part of the agreement is, okay, we're going to pay you, go away, this stays quiet.
Right.
So how come that got out? I'm surprised the hospital didn't say, okay, we're going to settle, here's your $6 million, but it could maybe potentially have never gotten out.
I don't have an answer to that, Nick.
Okay. But did that surprise you?
Yes,
that you thought,
it did.
all right, they
It did
settled out of
surprise me.
court, and some of that would mean that, and which would mean to this day, you and I would not have known he had died perhaps by a mistake made.
Correct.
But it did get out, and we realized obviously something was done, or they wouldn't have paid $6 million.
I am surprised that the hospital did not settle this thing in a manner to keep this buried so no one would ever know. Can you imagine this hospital is going to be forever known as the one that killed the first man who walked on the moon? So I don't understand why this got public. I'm sure there are a lot of reasons for it that we don't know, that won't ever wind up in the press, but now we know. And the point of this, as you and I were saying, was this can happen to anybody.
Yeah.
It doesn't discriminate on the basis of wealth, celebrity, color, religion. It doesn't matter. Bad medical care can happen to anyone, which is all the more reason why, in my opinion, you have to make sure, first of all, that you're a smart patient, a smart consumer. And then if something bad happens to you, you need to find a board-certified medical malpractice lawyer to represent you or a family member if somebody's been hurt, because the odds are, unfortunately, someone's going to get hurt more often than not.
Amazing. All right, before we go to, we'll take our first break, and we'll come back. We've got some calls coming in, and you're on hold. Stay there. We'll get to you. The number 737-7587. That's instructive there. It's a little scary is what it is.
Very.
We've got some other cases Clint can talk about, as well as take your phone calls about medical malpractice. We'll get to those right after this. Stay with us.